My name is Mary Harper, and I'm Africa editor at the BBC World Service, and I have a special interest in Somalia. I've reported from the country for the past 25 years, so it's great to be here, and it's great to see so many people in the audience, and also apparently we have lots and lots of people online as well, which is wonderful. And I'd like to welcome both of the audiences. For the online audiences, we really want you to get involved in the conversation. So if you can come up with questions for the panel, and if you can put them in the chat box below the live stream, then I'll take as many as I can during the question and answer session. And we want to give lots of time for questions. So please think of as many difficult questions as you want for the panel. For those who are in the room, if you could please turn your phones to silent. But for those who are in the Twitter sphere, it would be great if you could tweet about the event. The hashtag is #withSomalia. So there's already a bit of a buzz going on about this. So if you could keep that going, that would be great. And as far as this discussion goes, basically a year ago, there was great optimism in Somalia, which after a long and complex voting process, which involved a few thousand people rather than a few hundred people, as had happened previously, this led to the selection of President Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed Farmajo. Mr. Farmajo has the name Mr. Cheese because his father was apparently very fond of cheese during the Italian colonial period. And he's somebody who's also had a very short-lived, but he was a popular prime minister when he was in that post some years previously. And in some ways, some observers felt that if Somalia had been able to have a one-person, one-vote election, it's quite likely that Mr. Farmajo would have actually been the people's president as well. So there was a great deal of optimism about his election. There have been some signs of progress under Mr. Farmajo. I think as a journalist, we always find more room to criticise than to praise. But really, there have been some positive signs. For example, the fact that 1 year on, the same prime minister is still in office is an achievement because they usually get sacked pretty fast. There's usually quite a fast turnover of prime ministers, which leads to all sorts of problems. Also in December, the IMF commended the Somali authorities on their progress on policy reforms and also on the successful completion of the country's first staff-monitored programme since the end of the civil war. So there have been some positive steps. But for many people, especially perhaps those in Somalia, perhaps especially those in Mogadishu, some of the optimism has really dissipated. For example, in October, there was what's referred to as Mogadishu's 9/11, with a massive truck bombing that killed more than 500 people. And there's also been many, many other attacks continuing in the country, conducted not just by al-Shabaab, but by clan militias, regional armies, land grabbers, all sorts of groups who continue to ensure that violence is a daily part of many people's lives. And in fact, something that was fairly worrying, one could say, that the BBC, where I work, every so often they compile a map of Somalia and with who controls what territory, and they've just come up with a new one this month, and it shows that al-Shabaab is actually in control of more, or at least has a significant presence in more parts of Somalia than it did 18 months ago, that actually various stretches along the coast, various towns, and especially various roads have actually been lost by AMISOM, the African Union Force, and the Somali army. There's also some fears are being expressed because AMISOM says at least that it's on the way out. That's okay. I was wondering what was happening. The AMISOM has already, 1,000 troops have already left AMISOM. Another 1,000 are supposed to leave this year, and it's supposed to complete its withdrawal by the year 2020. And there does seem to be consensus amongst many observers that the Somali army is in no way ready to take over to guarantee the security of Somalis. As well as the security challenges, there are very big humanitarian issues. There's been years of drought. Somalia did, though, manage to avert what was widely predicted to be conditions set for famine, and it averted that last year, which is definitely an achievement. But it's estimated that about half the country's population are in dire need of humanitarian assistance. And in response to this, earlier this month, DFID and OCHA convened a high-level meeting in London to draw urgent attention to this humanitarian crisis and the need for a swift and substantial response. And the aim of this event here at the ODI is to kind of build on the momentum of that meeting and really try to drill down on what are the main drivers of conflict in Somalia and whether there is any prospect for peace, and if it's achieved, how it could be sustained, to ask questions about what the Somali government and others in the international community, but perhaps particularly, should do about security now that AMISOM has started to leave. And also this issue, there is an increasing number of countries that are getting actively involved in Somalia. For example, recently there's been various tussles between the UAE and Qatar and other countries, and what can be done to try to manage all of those influences that are converging on Somalia. Well, to answer these difficult questions, the ODI has assembled really what I would say is a dream panel. I couldn't have made up a better one. So we have great people who can talk about this. To my left is Michael Keating, who's the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Somalia and head of the UN Assistance Mission to the country. Michael's had extensive experience working with political and peace-building transitions. He's worked as Associate Director at Chatham House. He's been a Senior Advisor to the Secretary General Special Envoy to Syria and also Deputy SRSG in Afghanistan. So he has a remarkable pedigree in these fields. To my right is Sara Pantuliano, I hope that's right, who's Managing Director here at the ODI, where she's led the humanitarian team for 6 years. She's a member of the Global Future Council on the Humanitarian System of the World Economic Forum and Managing Editor of Disasters Journal, as well as being a trustee of IRIN News and SOS Sahel. Sarah's also worked with the UNDP on its peace-building unit in Sudan. Joining us from Nairobi, we can see at the bottom of the screen there, is a former colleague of mine, Rashid Abdi, who used to work with BBC Monitoring, and I always used to read his analyses of the situation in the Horn of Africa. I learned a great deal from Rashid. He's now the director of the Horn of Africa section of the International Crisis Group, and he has a PhD in comparative religion and philosophy. He's also a fellow of the Rift Valley Institute and has worked not only for the BBC but for the Daily Nation in Kenya. So he's a former journalist. And last but not least, here on the screen is Professor Ken Menkhaus, who's in North Carolina. He's professor at Davidson College, where he's taught since the early 1990s. He's published more than 100 articles, book chapters, monographs and reports on Somalia, and is definitely one of the world authorities on the country. He did his PhD in Somalia in the early 90s, and he's also worked as a special political advisor for the UN operation in Somalia. So we really have got a stellar cast of people to talk to us today. So welcome to the panel, and thank you everybody for coming. I think, Michael, we'll start with you. So it's been a year now since President Farmajo came to office, and it would be great if you could kind of give us an assessment of how you think him and his government have been doing this past year. What are the main challenges his government faces, and not just his government, but the UN and other interested groups in Somalia? I mean, do we have any reason to be optimistic about Somalia, or should we just treat it as the basket case it's often referred to in media?
I am shocked you're asking me that question, Mary. My answer is there are very strong grounds for continuing to be optimistic about Somalia, but that does not mean that the challenges the country faces aren't formidable. As I like to say, people who haven't been to Somalia for many years or who have never been there tend to have an image of the country which is defined, through films like Black Hawk Down or Captain Phillips or other things. And the news of Somalia tends to be of bombs and violence and hunger and famine. But of course, the reality is actually very different. For those of you who haven't been, say, to Mogadishu or many of the other cities and go back there after a while, the transformation is visible. So at a superficial level, things are definitely different. But that is not to say that the progress being made in Somalia isn't irreversible. The challenges are, of course, enormous. You've touched on many of them already. It is a terrible place to be a woman, to have a child. It is the human rights deficits are multidimensional. The number of people who are displaced, the last year saw 1 million new displaced people on top of 1 million previously. The insecurity is a reality for most people in the population, whether you're well off or poor. That insecurity takes many different forms. And the most high-profile one was, of course, the bomb in Mogadishu on October the 14th. Unfortunately, the numbers keep climbing. We now think it's over 600. And as you say, it's the worst improvised explosive device ever in the history of the world in terms of the number of people killed or maimed. Al-Shabaab, despite the fact that I believe it is under a lot of pressure, retains the capacity to inflict enormous damage and is raising the cost of everything in Somalia, both the human cost, the financial cost of everything, making everything much more difficult. And as you've also mentioned, Somalia is in a part of the world that is considered to be very strategic, and it continues to be a place in which powers tend to play out their rivalries and in which their geopolitical ambitions crash into each other. And it has been very vulnerable to that. But having said that, I do think there have been some extraordinarily positive things that have taken place in the last couple of years. And, perhaps I can only really talk with some authority for the period that I've been there, which is approaching 2.5 years. And even in that period, there are now conversations taking place in Somalia that simply were not taking place a year ago, whether in the socioeconomic field, whether in the security field, or in the political field. In the socioeconomic field, I suppose the most salient issues relate to the determination of this government and this Prime Minister to try and raise taxes and revenues for the state, whether through normalization of the relationship with the international financial institutions, or by reaching a political understanding, as it were, with the private sector, that in return for paying taxes, the private sector will receive services such as security, infrastructure, vocational training, and all the rest of it. That is not to say that these things are necessarily yet happening, but that conversation is very alive, and I don't know how closely I see there are many Somalis in the room, but no doubt you've been watching all these issues in the port with people refusing to pay taxes and the Ministry of Finance saying, well, you've got to pay taxes, and this provoking a discussion about where you collect the taxes and why can you collect taxes in Mogadishu and not in Kismayo. These kind of conversations were not taking place a year or two ago.
Don't people get a bit annoyed now? I hear that they're complaining that they now have to pay 2 sets of taxes, one to al-Shabaab, even people in the heart of Mogadishu, and then another set of taxes now to the government, and the government perhaps can't give them some of the things that al-Shabaab can.
Yes, I mean, in certain areas, Shabaab can provide security in a way that the government can't. So if the private sector is saying, we will pay you taxes if you are better at providing security than al-Shabaab, then that is a very strong incentive, and it's something I think the government is taking very seriously. And that actually leads to a second issue where I think there's real progress and a very different conversation going on, which is how can the security sector be sorted out. And in the last 18 months, there's been an agreement on the national security architecture. There's adoption of an approach to security called the comprehensive approach to security, which recognizes that security isn't just a military issue. It's also about rule of law and policing. It's about local governance. It's about countering violent extremism. And it's also about addressing some of the grievances that fuel insecurity. So that's very significant. And most recently, in the last couple of weeks, there's been the adoption of something called the transition plan. I think you referred to this, the security transition plan, whereby the Somalis are now defining an agenda over the next 1 to 4 years where they want to assume much greater responsibility for security while recognizing that they are not in a position to do that yet. Something that some of you may have heard of called an operational readiness assessment has been undertaken. It is very brave of the government to do this. Essentially what it was a fairly intrusive review of what the capability of the Somali army and the Somali police is, and that revealed that they are in very poor shape, actually. And the Minister of Finance has embarked on a process to try and get the payroll sorted out. There's a recognition that you need to strengthen institutions, not just train people, and that security is also about working with local communities, building local governance systems. So that's also a very big development. Mary, I don't think that was happening 2 years ago. It's new. Another positive development is last year a national development plan was adopted, the first one since the 1980s. And that is genuinely driving the conversation between the government and the development partners. I mean, you've got to have your stuff, in the national development plan if you expect to get funding from the common pot. Now, of course, there are some partners to Somalia that don't, non-OECD DAC partners that don't necessarily go through these mechanisms, but still, it is increasingly getting traction. The idea that you need a development plan. And again, for those of you who are in the room who know Somalia, the idea that Somalia had a development plan a few years ago was fanciful. It was all about humanitarian aid and security. But now there's a development plan. That raises, I think, another issue, which is how can Somalia break what seems to be its perennial dependency upon humanitarian aid? What kind of investments can be made, given that the country, at one level, is actually very viable? I mean, it's got tremendous resources, wind power, solar power. It's got 2 phenomenal rivers. It used to be one of the biggest agricultural exporters in Africa, the biggest banana exporter in Africa. It does not have a massive population. I mean, the fundamentals are pretty good. And ironically, as a result of so many years of conflict, it's got an amazing diaspora, extraordinary trading links. So there's some really good things going for Somalia. And there's another conversation is how do you get away from humanitarian aid exclusively and start investing in things like urbanization, water management, tertiary infrastructure and so on to create public works, jobs, and things like that. So I know it would be more useful to have a conversation rather than a long kind of, sort of speech by me, but I just want to end at this point by saying I don't underestimate the political challenges. And fundamentally, you said, how does the UN see things? I mean, I see the UN's role is actually trying to help Somalis figure out what kind of state they want. What kind of state Somali becomes is up to Somalis. It's not up to anybody else. The whole federalism project is about Somalis talking to themselves about what kind of powers they're prepared to share and what kind of powers they want to keep to themselves. It is a complicated discussion because it requires a constitutional agreement on whether there's a presidential system or a parliamentary system or some kind of mixture. What is the relationship between the federal government and the federal member states? Who has the authority to raise revenues? Who has the authority to assign revenues? Who has the authority to tax? Who has the authority to command, the police and the army and the maritime? Very complicated discussions. But what's exciting is being there right now with all these conversations taking place, not helped, by the way, by Somalia having a very fluid political marketplace, which in my view needs to be stabilized. And there are a number of very practical ways in which it can be stabilized, because if it isn't stabilized, this commendable agenda by the government to get debt relief, to sort out the security sector, to deliver services, is going to be endlessly hostage to Somali politics. And the national political sport in Somalia is impeachment and motions of no confidence and, external actors taking advantage of this.
Facing one of
and
these
yesterday, there was an impeachment motion against the speaker, which I gather an hour ago collapsed. There's another one against the Prime Minister, motion of no confidence. But this is Somali politics. And I think at a certain point there need to be stronger rules and regulations to stabilize this, and in particular, as the President keeps saying, to do something about corruption, which is really horrendous. I mean, the institutions are, the law is very weak, and fighting corruption is really going to be a fundamental issue and requires both structural and intrusive measures.
Thank you very much, Michael, and there'll be plenty of time for you to answer people's questions when we've gone through the other panelists. And Sarah, if I could turn to you now. The conflicts in Somalia are incredibly complex, and they've actually been going on for far longer than al-Shabaab's been in existence. It's been in existence for about a decade. Conflict in Somalia has been going on, internal conflict anyway, for at least 30 years. And you've recently republished a report here at the ODI analysing whether the UN system is actually fit to sustain peace. And I wondered whether you could just talk us through this report and how it applies to Somalia. That would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, this was quite a large endeavor that we were commissioned to take forward by the UN agencies, funds and programs. So that was the collective group of agencies, funds and programs of the UN that are supposed to deliver on this agenda that is called sustaining peace, which really emerged from all the reviews that happened in 2015 of the peace building architecture, peace operations, women, peace and security, and is actually enshrined in both a General Assembly and a Security Council resolution. So it's something that the UN somehow has to get on with and deliver. And it takes the whole concept of peace building, which is always been quite projectized and technocratic, into a much more all-encompassing concept that goes from prevention to addressing root causes of conflict, working with parties to end hostilities, national reconciliation, and then recovery, reconstruction, and development, like everything really, which of course is part of the problem because the concept is so all-encompassing that it's become quite nebulous. And so what came out of the review was that actually the vast majority of, I would say all the agencies, funds and programs are really struggling to operationalize the concept, to really make that meaningful in terms of programs and, operations on the ground. So it has become, or it risks becoming a bit of a catch-all, concept to which everything is tagged, so everything is sustaining peace. Somalia was supposed to be one of the case studies that we were supposed to, to use for the review, but because of the pre-famine situation, we were not able to go to Somalia. So I'll just say something about the general findings and then how really they relate to Somalia. So what came out beyond the how nebulous the concept is also that in a way there is not enough buy-in by the leadership, the top leadership of the UN, both at headquarters and in country, in the concept. Somalia is perhaps an exception, but in many ways we haven't seen the concept being in a way trickle down at the level of each in this individual agency, fund or program, and a directive come from other the top of the organization at headquarters or in country to say this is really an agenda that we need to deliver on. In addition to that, in country, you see a very fragmented capacity of resident coordinators to actually be able to lead the collective to deliver on this. They don't have the ability, they can muster the resources that are financial or human for the whole UN system to pull together and work together. There is no incentive to pull these resources. And that's not just in terms of coming together to to deliver programs, but even to do the analysis together, to do an analysis of the conflict. You say how long the conflict has been going on in Somalia. in each country that we examine, the analysis of the context and the conflicts is done in complete isolation, or very, very little sort of joint effort. And the other big problem is around going even beyond the UN system, because within there is a lot of fragmentation and competition, but actually the partnership with government and civil society is often even worse. And I think particularly with local actors, that came out as one of the weakest points in the review. The ability to work with with the civil society, with forces in countries that actually sometimes, very often, are better placed in the UN in addressing, delivering on the sustaining peace agenda, and doing an assessment really of what the UN can do, what its limitations are, what its comparative advantages, and how to become a catalyst for others is something that unfortunately doesn't really happen. Now, what we're seeing with the current UN Secretary General is an effort to try and really push the system in a different direction. And I often say, if he can succeed with the political sort of acumen he has and the knowledge of the system, then maybe the UN is doomed. Because, absolutely. Yeah. But there is definitely an effort to reform the development system, to make both prevention and sustaining peace a focus for the UN going forward, and to try to streamline some of the the administrative and processes and systems. The other side of the equation that came out of the review is the role of member states, because of course there is a lot the UN could do to do things better, but there is a lot more that the member states can do to enable the UN. And a big part of the problem is, whilst obviously this is an agenda mandated by the member states, it's General Assembly resolution, Security Council resolution, actually the member states that sit in the executive boards of these agency funds and programs operate very differently from those who sit in the General Assembly and the Security Council. So there has been actually no translation at the level of the executive boards of these agencies to say that's what you need to deliver, that's how you need to deliver. And very little effort to empower the UN to do so, both in terms of political backing and financial resources. And it's not for me a matter of giving the UN more money to deliver, but giving it different money to deliver. So, moving away from the very projectized and, sort of partitioned level of funding that the UN receives to deliver in country on these issues, but something which is much more systematic, structured, pulled together.
And in terms of Somalia,
and so you see all of this in Somalia, where actually at the level of the leadership, you see leadership, in the UN. Michael, the current RCHC, they are, I think, are quite a rare example in the UN system of trying to, first of all, own the concept, deliver on operationally on the concept, working with partners, working with the government to deliver, but being held back by these challenges, both in terms of the structure of the UN in country, how fragmented the different parts of the system are, the processes that don't enable that collegiate joined up operation, and of course the fragmentation of the member states behind, with different agendas moving in different directions, supporting different parts of the system, including the delivery on the security agenda in very different ways. And so I think it's a demonstration that even when you have some of the best capacities in the system in country, you're still going to struggle until we have a reform that is much deeper, that comes from sort of higher up, with member states that really enable that to happen.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And if I could turn to Rashid in Nairobi now. Rashid, we've talked about how AMISOM is planning to withdraw from Somalia and has already started the process. And it would be good to get your thoughts on this, Rashid, like how on earth is Somalia going to manage its security if AMISOM is not there? What should the government of Somalia, the UN and others be doing in order to try to avert any potential crisis that would follow the departure of AMISOM? Can we hear from Rashid? Yes, great.
And thank you also to ODI for organizing this event. I think when the whole AMISOM peacekeeping mission was conceived, it was never going to be an open-ended engagement in Somalia or intervention. It was, a stopgap measure to allow the Somali National Army and other security forces basically to take over from AMISOM. The AMISOM mission is now in its 11th year, and during that period, I think AMISOM has achieved significant, progress. They have managed to push out al-Shabaab from the major towns, also the key, strategic ports and also centers in South Central Somalia. However, al-Shabaab continues to remain very strong in the countryside. And as I have repeated many times, it is impossible to secure these urban centers without also putting pressure on al-Shabaab in the countryside. Al-Shabaab now enjoys free reign in the countryside. And I think that explains the dilemma for AMISOM. Every time AMISOM has tried to expand beyond the urban centers, it has stretched its supply lines and actually attracted attacks from al-Shabaab. And they have taken heavy casualties. And I think we don't speak much about it, but you are now talking of probably the costliest operation in Africa. And countries like Burundi, Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia have actually lost significant numbers of troops in Somalia. Now, to go back to your question, there's no doubt that AMISOM will at some point leave. Somalis also desire for AMISOM to leave. And the problem is the Somali National Army capable of taking over the security responsibilities? And the answer clearly is no. There is a debate on how long it will take the Somali National Army to be fixed, how long the Somali National Army will be capable of taking over security responsibilities. But clearly, we are not talking of years. Probably we are talking of not less than 5 years. This is going to be a long struggle. And any hasty withdrawal of AMISOM is going to be catastrophic for Somalia.
And Rashid, do you think AMISOM has an appetite to stay longer than it says it will?
That is actually one of the biggest issues. Depends, first of all, on resources. There is no doubt that there is conflict fatigue within AMISOM. Soldiers want to go back home. Army commanders are fatigued and tired. So, after a 10-year mission, it is going to be like that. It's not going to be any different. The problem, again, has been the issue of resources, and the relations between AMISOM and donors has not been very good in the last 2 or 3 years, largely because of funding cuts. So there are, I think, clear challenges for AMISOM. This was not actually even a peacekeeping mission. This has become a peace enforcement mission. It has grown to a massive, 22,000 strong, troop, level. So, the resources needed to keep this AMISOM mission going for years is also not going to be there. So. To go back to your question, I think there's no doubt that AMISOM exit plan, can only work well if it is synchronized with also the building up of the Somali National Army. Otherwise, I think for AMISOM to basically say, because we are not getting resources, we want to leave the country, I think that will be clearly disastrous, because the countries that will pay the price will ultimately be those countries that have contributed troops to Somalia. These are countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda. So AMISOM's exit plan has to work with a transitional plan in which the Somali National Army is actually significantly enhanced. And that is not going to be an easy task. There are many structural, systemic problems with the Somali National Army, and there are even people who question the very concept of a Somali National Army. They say, the current army as it exists is simply a glorified clan army, and so it's going to require a lot of work to really build a professional military which is not corrupt. Remember, just a few months ago, the United States government stopped funding, stopped some critical, assistance to the Somali National Army because of corruption concerns. And that, I think, is also part of the problem.
Rashid, thank you very much. We'll come back to you at the question and answer session. But if we could now turn to Ken. And Ken, one thing that some people ask is that has it been a mistake to focus so closely on al-Shabaab when Somalia is affected by so many other kinds of violence between different clans, between regional armies? There's been quite a lot of violence between the federal states recently, violence over land, business and politicians ordering assassinations and so much more. Should we, how are we going to address all these other kinds of violence in Somalia when so much of the focus is on al-Shabaab? And what should President Farmajo and his government do about this?
Thank you. I think that your question was really put to the test a few months ago when Mogadishu appeared at one point to be on the brink of major political violence that had very little to do with al-Shabaab, that had to do with rising clan tensions within the government that had everyone right at the edge of their seats. And that was a wake-up call, reminder that much of the political violence and the threat of armed conflict in the country has to do with other forces besides al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab, however, is deeply embedded in the political violence directly and indirectly, and that's what I'd really like to get to in my comments. Is when we think about political violence in Somalia, it's part of a set of other syndromes that includes corruption, and that includes intentional political deinstitutionalization or conscious efforts to undermine and prevent rule of law and a functional government. Those three things can't be understood in isolation from one another, and they form a system that has evolved in Somalia over the past quarter of a century of state collapse. Systems are, by definition, pervasive. Systems are integrated, so all different sections of society are bound up in it, and systems are self-reinforcing. And I think what we have seen in Somalia is the rise of a system that includes routinized rules of the game on the use of political violence, both by al-Shabaab, by politicians, by business people, by clans, all in pursuit of two things in Somalia, which dominate the political landscape. One is survival, and the other is appropriation of resources. The fact is, Somalis are compelled to work within this system that has emerged over the past quarter of a century, even if they hate it. And many Somalis, of course, hate this. But there's just no way to ignore it or try to pretend it doesn't exist. This system has included the rise of cartels and networks. That's really what we see, both with Shabaab, with clans, with some of the government agencies. This is a network of networks in Somalia, a set of competing mafias and cartels that make use of political violence when they see fit. It's also characterized by very high levels of collusion. And that, again, gets to your question about al-Shabaab. The fight against al-Shabaab has to be put in the context of al-Shabaab often colluding with the very parties that we think are fighting it. Al-Shabaab has very effectively penetrated those other entities, whether it's AMISOM or the Somali government or regional member states. It has done a very effective job of creating insecurity and then providing the means to protect you from it, which is another way to say it's a very good extortion racket, what we called taxes a little while ago by al-Shabaab, others would call extortion. And all of this, of course, has harnessed clanism in a particularly destructive way. So those things, again, all feed into a system that's in place. It's going to be very difficult to break. That includes, again, routinized use of political violence. There are rules of the game that people have with regard to violence. I say this because part of your question was, what can President Formaggio do? And I think when you're thinking about systems, it's just much bigger than one person, much bigger than one leader. Systems do change, and I think that's where we have to be optimistic, and try to find channels of energy and interests in Somalia that look to replace and undermine this system, and we do have them. They're going to have to come from both above and below. We're going to have to see leadership by example at the highest ends of the government, restricting and eventually eliminating the use of political violence. We're going to have to see grassroots movements that create new rules of the game. That this is not done in our city. This is not done in our region. And I suspect it'll.
Examples of this, Ken? Are there any examples of this already happening?
Certainly across, that's one of the things about Somalia that's so fascinating, is that you can come across such diverse situations from one town to the next. Somaliland has done, I think, a very good job at establishing different rules of the game regarding mobilization of clanism, regarding use of political violence. I think it's slipped in recent years, and that's a bit worrisome. But they clearly have a different set of rules of the game regarding political violence. In Kismayo now you've got enforced peace. There are rules of the game that aren't necessarily likely to hold if the Jubaland government were not imposing it by force, but it's a relatively peaceful place. We've seen over time towns and cities like in Boroma. There was a time years ago where I've spent time in Beledweyne and in Johar, where they had relative peace, and they had what some might call an elite compact about what you can and can't do. That's going to take time and is going to be subject to reversals, but I think that's the only way to see an eventual decline in the use of political violence as a tool that the elites use against one another.
Thank you very much, Ken.